The call didn't come through dispatch. It came through a frequency that hadn't been used in 4 years. An encrypted channel so old the hospital's radio system shouldn't have even been able to receive it. But it did, and the voice on the other end said 3 words that made the blood drain from Sergeant Major Declan Firth's face. Find Ghost Actual. Nobody at Harlow County General knew what that meant. But the 12 Black Hawk helicopters, already burning hard across the Nevada desert, did. The fluorescent lights of the Harlow County General Hospital Emergency Department had a particular quality to them. Not quite white, not quite yellow. Something in between that made everyone look slightly ill even before they were. Margot Laine had spent 3 years under those lights, and she had stopped noticing them the same way you stop noticing a scar. You know it's there. You just don't look anymore. She was 31, though most of the staff quietly assumed she was older. There was something about the economy of her movements. Nothing wasted, nothing soft. That read as age when it wasn't. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight braid that she had retightened twice that shift already, a habit she was only half aware of. Her left hand had a faint tremor that appeared when she was very tired or very cold. She kept it in her scrubs pocket whenever possible. Her title at Harlow County was Patient Flow Coordinator, a deliberately vague name for a deliberately diminished role. She filed transfer paperwork, tracked bed availability, and shepherded confused patients through the labyrinthine discharge process. She was, in the politely devastating language of the hospital administration, an organizational asset. She was not clinical staff. She was not a nurse of record. She was not permitted in active trauma bays without explicit physician authorization. Dr. Leonard Ashby had made that last point very clear during her 3rd week on the job. "You're a coordinator, Laine," he had told her, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. Ashby was the department chief. Harvard-trained, double-boarded, the kind of man who had a dedicated parking space and a plaque outside his office. He wasn't cruel. He was simply certain with the deep, unexamined certainty of someone who had never once been wrong in a room full of people who needed him to be right. "Your role is administrative. I need you focused on throughput, not clinical decisions. Leave the medicine to the people who practice it." She had nodded. She had said, "Understood, Doctor." Ashby. She had not said, "I practiced it in places you will never go, on people you will never meet, under conditions that would have folded you in half." She had not said, "I have clotted wounds with my bare hands in the back of a burning vehicle 3 miles outside a city that no longer exists on any map you'd have access to." She had not said any of it because she had learned, in the years since coming home, that saying it only made things harder. So she filed the paperwork. She tracked the beds. She wore the lanyard that read Harlow County General, Administrative, and kept her left hand in her pocket and her eyes on the floor. The tremor had started in Kandahar. She didn't talk about that either. It was a Wednesday in October when the Hendricks boy came in. Margot was at the coordinator's station at the far end of the ERR corridor, a half-walled alcove with 2 monitors, a printer that perpetually jammed, and a direct sightline to the ambulance bay. She saw the paramedics bring him in at 9:47 p.m. 17 years old, they said. Mountain bike accident on the ridge trail, came down wrong on a switchback, impacted a granite outcropping at speed. GCS of 12 on scene, dropping. She watched through the glass partition as Ashby's team assembled around Bay 2. She watched resident Pilar Okonkwo, sharp, careful, 2 years out of med school, start the primary survey. She watched the tech hang the first bag of saline. She also watched the boy's color. It was the color that got her. That particular gray beige that lived in the narrow space between alive and not. She had seen it in Kandahar, in Helmand, in a forward operating base in a country she was technically never supposed to have been in. She had seen it on men who were bleeding fast into spaces where blood was not supposed to go. She pulled up the bay on her coordination monitor, where she had passive access to incoming vitals. Blood pressure was 88/60 and falling. Heart rate 124. The CT wasn't back yet. She didn't need the CT. The mechanism of injury, the vital trend, the skin color, the subtle distension she could see even from across the glass. It was a picture she knew by heart. Splenic laceration, almost certainly grade 3 or above. He was hemorrhaging internally, and the rate suggested he had maybe 15 minutes before the pressure dropped below the threshold for salvage. She crossed the hallway to the bay door. Dr. Ashby. She kept her voice level. Ashby looked up from the chart tablet, his expression shifting immediately into the particular patients he reserved for administrative interruptions. Laine. I'm in the middle of a resuscitation. His pressure has dropped 18 points in 4 minutes. The mechanism and the presentation are consistent with a high-grade splenic lac. He needs a fast exam now, and if it confirms free fluid, he needs to go to the AOR before the CT. The bay went very quiet. Pilar Okonkwo looked at Margot, then she looked at Ashby. She's the coordinator, Ashby said, not to Okonkwo, but to the room in general, in the tone of a man explaining something obvious. Laine, I appreciate the concern, but I need you to step back and let us work. You are not cleared to be in this bay. He turned back to the patient. Let's get the CT moving. There isn't time for Laine. His voice hardened. Just slightly. Just enough. Please. She stepped back. She stood in the hallway with her hand flat against the cold wall and listened to the monitor. 7 minutes later, the tone shifted. The long, unbroken note of a flat line is not like it sounds in movies. It is smaller, more domestic. It sounds like a microwave finishing its cycle. She heard it from the hallway, and she closed her eyes and she breathed. The boy survived, just barely, after 22 minutes of resuscitation and an emergency splenectomy that Ashby performed in a controlled fury. His composure locked down so tight it looked like serenity. Afterward, one of the OR nurses told Margot quietly that Ashby had found exactly what the coordinator called. She hadn't responded. She'd gone back to the alcove and filed the night's transfer paperwork, her left hand very still. The next morning, a formal note appeared in her personnel file. Inappropriate clinical interference. Violation of role boundaries. She read it twice. She put it in the drawer. She had been home for 4 years. She had learned that home had its own kind of ambush. 3 weeks after the Hendricks boy, the night shift was unremarkable until it wasn't. Margot was 2 hours from the end of her shift when the disaster radio on the wall, a relic that most of the staff forgot existed, crackled to life with a sound she had not heard in 4 years. Not the content, the cadence. The way emergency military communications were structured was different from civilian frequencies. Compressed, layered, urgent in a very particular, controlled way, like a man screaming through clenched teeth. She was the only one in the corridor who stopped walking when it came through. Multiple casualties, Sierra convoy, grid reference. The voice dissolved into static. Then, clearer. Repeat, we need a ground facility. Primary asset has a through and through with retained fragment. Secondary has tension pneumo-developing. We have a critical with another burst of static. Requesting any facility within 60 miles of grid November Kilo 7. We are declaring emergency. Does anyone copy? We are declaring. The radio died. Margot stood in the hallway for 3 seconds. Then she walked to the charge nurse's desk. Did anyone catch that transmission? The charge nurse, a good nurse, competent and overworked, whose name was Rebecca, looked up. Transmission? Margot looked at the silent radio. There's a military convoy in distress, she said, approximately 60 miles out, maybe less. They're going to need trauma bays. Rebecca's expression was patient and slightly skeptical. Our disaster line hasn't rung. It will. Rebecca started to respond. The disaster line rang. They came in from the west, which was wrong. The nearest base was east. And they came fast, faster than she would have expected, given the transmission's desperate edge. Later she would learn they had already been burning hard toward Harlow County. When the radio call went out, that someone in the chain of command had been tracking the hospital's capacity on a tablet in the back of a Humvee and had made the decision before the request was even formally transmitted. The first vehicle hit the ambulance bay at 2:14 a.m. It wasn't an ambulance. It was a military tactical vehicle. JLTV. She registered automatically. Joint Light Tactical Vehicle, the newer platform. And it was followed by 2 more, and then a 4th that was moving differently from the others. Faster, the emergency lights strobing in a pattern she recognized as critical cargo. Not a patient who might die. A patient who was actively dying. The back of the 4th vehicle opened before it fully stopped. 3 soldiers in full kit emerged first, establishing immediate perimeter, weapons down but hands ready. Then came the litter team. 4 people moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this before, who had carried men out of places under fire, and had learned that speed and stillness were not opposites. Margot was already at the ambulance bay doors. She shouldn't have been. Her role was administrative. She should have been at the coordinator station, preparing bed assignments, readying the transfer documentation that would be needed when all of this was over. She was in the ambulance bay because her legs had carried her there while her mind was still catching up. The man on the litter was in bad shape. She could see that from 15 feet. The field dressings on his torso were saturated, dark venous blood, not the bright arterial spray that meant immediate exsanguination, but bad enough. His face had the papery, disconnected quality of a man whose body had decided to allocate resources very selectively. Walking beside the litter, one hand on the IV line running into the man's antecubital, was a soldier whose rank patch read CW2, Chief Warrant Officer, and whose expression was the controlled blankness of someone operating entirely on training because anything else would cost time. He stopped when he saw Margot. "This a trauma center?" "Level 2, she said. "Good enough. We need a surgeon who knows penetrating abdominal trauma. We need it now, and we need..." He stopped, looking at her lanyard, at the word "administrative." Something shifted behind his eyes, not dismissal, recalculation. "We need someone who knows what they're looking at. What's the mechanism?" He blinked. She wasn't supposed to know that question. Not according to the lanyard. 7.62 through and through, right upper quadrant, exit wound suggests it traversed the liver. He's been packed since 0100. He paused. Fragment may have clipped the portal triad. She was already moving, pulling on gloves she'd taken from the dispenser on the wall without thinking. How long since the packing? 73 minutes. Blood pressure trend over that time. Stable until 20 minutes ago. Then it started sliding. Rate of slide? He looked at her again. 8 to 10 points every 4 minutes. Margot did the math. He's got about 12 minutes before we lose the window for damage control. She looked up and found his eyes. Get him inside. I'll clear the bay. She turned and walked into the ER with the kind of speed that doesn't look like running, but covers the same ground. Dr. Ashby was not on shift. Dr. Ashby was home, asleep, reachable by the on-call line that the charge nurse was already dialing. The attending on the floor was a second-year emergency medicine hospitalist named Dr. Fennick, who was good in a standard emergency and who looked at the arriving military litter team with the expression of a man who had trained for this moment and was now discovering that training and the moment itself were not the same thing. Penetrating abdominal, portal region, possible hepatic involvement, Margot told him. He's been packed in the field for 73 minutes. Pressure is sliding, I'd estimate. I know how to assess a trauma patient, Fennick said, not unkindly. He was already pulling on gloves, already turning toward the bay. Get me surgical on the phone. Surgical attending is 40 minutes out. He absorbed that. Then we stabilize until 40 minutes is too long. Fennick stopped. He turned and looked at her. Laine. He knew her name from the personnel announcements. He had never actually spoken to her before tonight. I understand your concern, but your administrative staff, I need you to clear the bay and let me work. The chief warrant officer had followed the litter inside. He was standing 6 feet back, not interfering, taking in everything. His eyes moved from Fennick to Margot. Who are you? He said. To Margot. Patient flow coordinator, she said. He looked at her hands. The gloves she'd put on. The way she was standing, weight forward, ready. That's not what I asked. The monitor in Bay 1 began a rapid rhythmic alarm, pressure dropping. The litter team's medic called out a number that made Fennick's head snap around. Margot moved. She was through the bay door before Fennick turned back around. She was beside the patient before anyone moved to stop her. Her hands found the dressing on the upper right quadrant, assessing without removing, pressing without disturbing the clot. The 1,000 small judgments that were not procedures but the spaces between procedures. The things that kept people alive in the gaps. His pressure is tanking because the packing is losing purchase, she said. Her voice flat and clear, no waver in it. The clot is breaking down. He needs a hepatic packing revision, or he's going to exsanguinate before your surgeon walks through the door. She looked at Fennick, who was standing in the bay doorway with his gloves on and his mouth slightly open. I know you can't authorize me to do this. I know what my lanyard says. I am telling you what is happening in this man's body, and I need you to decide in the next 30 seconds what you're going to do with that information. Fennick stared at her. The monitor screamed. Do it, Fennick said. It cost him something. She could see that, but he said it. Margot Laine did not hesitate. What happened in Bay 1 over the next 22 minutes was not technically surgery. She was not a surgeon. She had never been a surgeon. What she had been, what she was a special operations combat medic who had spent 3 deployments doing the work that lived in the space between what's authorized and what keeps people breathing. And those 2 spaces were sometimes the same place, and sometimes very different places. And the skill was knowing which was which. She revised the hepatic packing with field technique. She called for specific supplies by names that half the ER techs didn't recognize. Quick clot combat gauze, a Foley for tamponade, a specific configuration of manual pressure that she directed with quiet, precise instructions. The ear nurse on the bay, a woman named Trudy, who had been doing this for 16 years, listened without question. her hands following Margot's directions with the unconscious competence of someone who trusted skill when she saw it. The chief warrant officer stood at the bay door. He had not been asked to leave. He had not moved. His patient's pressure stabilized at 9 minutes and 42 seconds. She counted. By the time Dr. Ashby arrived, 28 minutes after the first call went out, not 40, because Ashby was the kind of man who moved fast when it was necessary. The patient was no longer immediately dying. He was still critically injured. He would need surgery, a real OR, a real surgical team, a proper repair that would take hours. But the window that had been closing had been held open, and the man on the table had a blood pressure and a pulse and a chance. Ashby stopped in the bay doorway. He looked at the patient. He looked at the equipment configuration. He looked at Margot. "Who did this?" he said. Nobody answered for a moment. "She did," said Trudy, without hesitation or apology. Ashby looked at Margot for a long time. "Get him to the OR," he said finally. Now, the hours that followed had their own texture. There was the surgery. Successful, she was told later. A 5-hour hepatic repair that Ashby performed with a vascular surgeon brought in from across the city. There were the other casualties. A soldier with tension pneumothorax that Fennick managed well once he found his footing, a burn injury from the vehicle fire that had started everything. 2 walking wounded who needed wound care and monitoring. There was the noise and light and smell of a mass casualty event at a level 2 center that had not been designed for it and was managing anyway, the way institutions manage, through the improvised competence of people who are better than their job titles. Margot went back to her coordinator station. She filed the incoming paperwork. She tracked the beds. She notated the intake documentation for each military patient with the careful thoroughness that Ashby had praised her for in her last performance review. Her left hand trembled slightly. She kept it in her pocket when she wasn't typing. At 5:30 a.m., the chief warrant officer found her at the coordinator alcove. He had been treated for a laceration on his forearm. She could see the fresh wrap. He still had his tactical vest on over his hospital gown, which should have been strange, but wasn't, on him. He stood at the entrance to the alcove and looked at her, and she kept her eyes on the monitor. "What's your name?" he said. "Laine," she said. "Patient Flow Coordinator. That's your title," he said. "I asked your name." She looked up at him. "Margot." He nodded, like that answered something. "See you, Darian Fitch," he said. "Sierra 7 Convoy, 3rd Special Forces Group." A pause. "I've been trying to figure out who you are since you walked into that bay. You read the lanyard." Lanyards lie. He held something out. She looked at it. It was a patch, subdued, no color, the kind worn on the left shoulder of a combat uniform rather than displayed. She recognized the unit insignia before she recognized why she recognized it. Her hands went still. "You deployed with 1st SFAB, Fitch said. "Kandahar, 2019. Helmand, 2020. And 1 rotation nobody officially talks about." It wasn't a question. "You were medivist out after an IED strike on a route clearance patrol. Lost 3 people. Multiple fractures, left hand nerve damage." His eyes dropped briefly to her pocket. "They said you couldn't go back." The ER was quiet around them. 5:30 a.m. quiet, the kind that came in the gap between the night's emergencies and the morning's intake. Someone was moaning softly, 2 bays down. A monitor beeped at steady intervals. "They were right," Margot said. "I couldn't." "You just did," Fitch said. She had no answer for that. He leaned against the alcove wall and crossed his arms. He wasn't leaving. "Man in that R," he said, is Captain Reuben Strand, 18-year SF veteran, 2 silver stars. He's got 4 kids. He paused. The medic we had on rotation is 19 years old and 8 months out of training. Good kid. Did everything right. Bought Strand the time to get here. Another pause. But what kept him alive in that bay was you. I violate about 6 hospital policies, Margot said. I know. Fitch's expression didn't change. So did I when I kicked the ambulance bay door open. We'll both fill out the forms. He was quiet for a moment. The group surgeon position, he said, has been vacant for 3 months. Civilian consultant attached to the unit. You'd need to clear the credentialing. Different process for your situation, but there's a pathway. I've seen it done. He looked at her. Someone with your profile, your clearances, your field experience. They've been trying to fill that slot since February. Margot was very still. I live here now, she said. I have an apartment. I have. She stopped. She looked at the coordinator alcove, the jammed printer, the 2 monitors, the lanyard on the table that said administrative. She thought about the personnel file drawer, the note inside it. Inappropriate clinical interference. She thought about the Hendricks boy, whose colors she'd read from across a glass partition, and the 7 minutes she'd spent in the hallway while the clock ran. She thought about a road outside a city that didn't appear on maps, and the smell of fuel and dust, and the weight of a man whose bleeding she'd stopped with her hands while the ground was still shaking. What would the role involve, she said. Fitch told her. Dr. Ashby came to find her at 6 o'clock as the day shift was beginning to arrive, and the night's aftermath was being absorbed into the ordinary business of a hospital morning. He looked like he always looked, composed, precise, but there was something different in the set of his face that she couldn't immediately name. He stood at the alcove entrance. She stood up. Sit down, he said, and his voice was different too. Quieter, please. She sat. He looked at the monitor, at the stack of intake forms, at the lanyard. Dr. Fennick briefed me, he said, fully. A pause. Trudy spoke with me as well. Margot waited. I have a question, Ashby said, and I would like an honest answer, which I understand I may not have earned. She kept her face neutral. All right. In the Hendricks case, he said, 6 weeks ago, when you came to the bay door, he stopped. You knew. It wasn't a question, but she answered it. Yes. How long had you known? From the first set of vitals I saw on the coordination monitor. Before you had the CT, he was quiet for a long moment. A cart rolled by in the corridor. Somewhere down the ward, a day shift nurse was laughing at something. I let a 17-year-old go into unnecessary arrest, Ashby said, because I was certain that the person telling me something important wasn't qualified to tell me anything. His voice was carefully level. He was a man who did not easily say hard things about himself. She could see the effort it cost him. I want you to know that I understand what that means. Margot said nothing. Quo Fitch spoke to me as well before he spoke to you, Ashby said. I know about the group surgeon position. A pause. I'm not here to ask you to stay. That isn't my business, and I'm aware I've given you very little reason to. He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the coordinator desk. It was a formal letter, on hospital letterhead, with his signature. That's a correction to your personnel file. The notation from the Hendricks incident is being removed. I've added a commendation for tonight's work, for whatever it's worth to you going forward. He stood. For what it's worth separately, he said. I'm sorry. That's a real apology, not an administrative one. He looked at the lanyard on the table. You were always more than the lanyard said. I was too, he stopped. I was too settled in my certainties to look. He left before she could respond. She sat alone in the alcove for a moment. She picked up the lanyard. She looked at the word "Bigministrative" in its neat hospital font. She set it down on the desk. She did not pick it up again. Darian Fitch was waiting for her in the lobby at 7 a.m. He had a cup of coffee from the vending machine. Not good coffee. The kind that came out of a machine at the end of a long night. And he handed it to her without being asked. She took it. "Strand made it through the ore," he said. "They're moving him to recovery." "I know," she said. "I've been tracking his bed status." He almost smiled. Old habits, something like that. They stood in the lobby for a moment. The early morning Nevada light was coming through the glass entrance, pale gold, the kind that made everything look briefly like a different version of itself. "I need an answer," Fitch said. "On the position. I know it's fast." "It's not that fast," she said. "I've been thinking about it for 4 years." He looked at her. "Not this specifically," she said. "But something like this, something that wasn't." She gestured at the coordinator alcove, at the lanyard she'd left on the desk. "That," Fitch nodded slowly. "We ship out for the European rotation in 4 weeks. Credentialing can move if there's reason to move it. I'll make the calls today." "Make the calls," she said. She drank the bad coffee. It tasted like every early morning at the end of a hard night, like the last hour before dawn, when the worst is over and the next thing hasn't started yet. She had missed that taste, she realized. Without meaning to, without knowing it, she had missed it for 4 years. The light through the lobby glass shifted as the sun climbed. And Harlow County General went on around them, the ordinary machinery of a morning. Nurses changing over, orderlies moving carts, a child crying somewhere in pediatrics, a doctor's voice calm and steady in a curtained bay. The world that had been held together by paperwork and lanyard distinctions and the careful geography of who was allowed dast and where. Margot Laine set down the empty cup. She walked to the coordinator alcove one last time, opened the desk drawer, and took out the personnel file note. Inappropriate clinical interference, and held it for a moment. Then she folded it in quarters and put it in her scrubs pocket, next to the hand that didn't shake anymore. She had a call to make, about credentialing, about timelines, about the particular and specific way a person puts their life back together when they've finally found the shape of it. Outside, the Nevada morning was wide open, and the road east ran straight and long toward everything she was going back to.